He had the look every promoter dreamed of. 6'6", carved from steel, born to dominate. He was trained by legends, cheered by millions, and built like a comic book god. But inside that perfect frame, his brain was dying. The same body that made him famous was quietly destroying him. He didn't fall in the ring. He fell long after the lights went out. This is the story of Andrew Test Martin, the man who looked invincible until science proved he wasn't. Long before the bright lights of Madison Square Garden, there was just Andrew. Born on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1975, in Whitby, Ontario, Andrew James Robert Patrick Martin was a quintessential Canadian kid. Whitby is a quiet suburban town on the shores of Lake Ontario, a place where life moves at a steady, predictable pace. It's a town of red brick houses, community centers, and cold winters. Andrew was the youngest of 3 brothers, born into a sturdy working-class family. His father, Robert, was a man who knew the value of hard labor, working in construction and later in the fast food industry to keep food on the table. His mother, Margaret, was the heart of the home. By all accounts, the Martins were a tight-knit, loving family. There were no horror stories of abuse or neglect in Andrew's childhood, a rarity in the biographies of many troubled wrestlers. He was loved. He was supported. But even in a happy home, Andrew stood out, quite literally. From a young age, he was growing at an alarming rate. He was always the tallest kid in the class, the one ducking under door frames by the time he was a teenager. In Canada, if you are big and athletic, your destiny is almost pre-written. You play sports. And Andrew played them all. He was a natural athlete, gifted with a coordination that belied his size. He played hockey, the national religion, skating with a power that terrified opposing defensemen. He played football, using his massive frame to bulldoze through lines. He played lacrosse, a sport known for its brutal physicality and high-impact collisions. It is here, on the frozen ponds and grassy fields of Ontario, that the seeds of his destruction may have been planted. Decades later, Dr. Bennett Omalu, the pathologist who examined Martin's brain, would suggest that the trauma found in Andrew's frontal lobes likely didn't start in the WWF. It started here, in high school sports. Every tackle, every check into the boards, every helmet-to-helmet collision was a micro-trauma, a subconcussive blow. The brain floating in the skull was being rattled over and over again, years before he ever took a bump in a wrestling ring. But in the early 90s, Andrew was just a star athlete. He attended Henry Street High School, where he was a popular figure. He wasn't the class clown, nor was he the brooding loner. He was the gentle giant. Friends from that era remember him as fiercely loyal and surprisingly shy. He had a reputation for being a tough guy, a necessary survival trait for a teenager of his size in Oshawa and Whitby. But he rarely started trouble. He was the kind of guy who would break up a fight rather than start one. However, despite his athletic prowess, Andrew didn't have a clear path to professional sports. He wasn't quite fast enough for the NHL or the NFL. So, when he graduated in 1993, he found himself in a state of drift. He had the body of a gladiator, but the resume of a regular teenager. He entered the workforce, taking jobs that utilized his only marketable skill at the time, his intimidation factor. He worked as a bouncer and a bartender in local clubs around Oshawa. It was a dangerous, gritty world. Dealing with drunks, breaking up brawls, and standing guard at the door taught him how to carry himself. He learned how to project authority without saying a word. He learned that silence could be scarier than shouting. During these years, Andrew began to sculpt his body with a new intensity. He hit the gym religiously. In the mid-90s, the bodybuilding culture was seeping into the mainstream, and Andrew became obsessed with size. He wanted to be bigger, harder, stronger. He transformed himself from a lanky athlete into a powerhouse. He was building the armor that he thought would protect him, unaware that he was also building the very thing that would attract the eyes of the wrestling world. Fate has a strange way of intervening in the lives of future stars. For Andrew Martin, fate took the form of a chance encounter at a Planet Hollywood restaurant in Toronto in 1997. Andrew was there just hanging out, perhaps grabbing a burger, standing out in the crowd as he always did. At 6 feet 6 inches and rippling with muscle, he was impossible to ignore. In the room that night was Carl DeMarco, the president of WWF Canada. DeMarco was a man whose job was to find talent, to find the next big thing, to feed the insatiable appetite of the World Wrestling Federation. DeMarco saw Andrew and didn't just see a big guy. He saw money. He saw a poster. He walked up to the young bouncer and asked the cliché question that has launched 1,000 careers. Have you ever thought about becoming a wrestler? Andrew had been a fan. He grew up watching the golden era of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, but like most kids, he viewed it as a television show, not a career path. It seemed impossible, a world reserved for cartoons, not kids from Whitby. But when a high-ranking executive asks you that question, the impossible suddenly feels within reach. DeMarco didn't just offer empty words. He offered a connection. He connected Andrew with the most reverent name in Canadian wrestling history, Bret the Hitman Hart. This was the Holy Grail. Bret Hart was not just a wrestler. He was a technician, an artist, and a national hero. To be trained by Hart, or even associated with him, was a stamp of legitimacy that could open every door in the industry. Andrew Martin, fueled by adrenaline and a sudden clarity of purpose, quit his jobs. He packed his bags. He was going to become a wrestler. Training for professional wrestling is not like training for any other sport. It is a process of deconstruction. You have to unlearn your natural instincts. When you fall, your instinct is to put your hands out to break the fall. In wrestling, if you do that, you break your wrists. You have to learn to fall flat, to disperse the impact across your back. You have to learn to trust another human being with your life, to let them throw you, twist you, and slam you, believing that they will protect you. Andrew began his training under the tutelage of two legends, Leo Burke and Bret Hart. The training took place in the harsh, unglamorous gyms of Canada. This was the old school way. There were no soft mats. There was no air conditioning. There was just sweat, pain, and the sound of bodies hitting the canvas. Bret Hart later recalled his first impressions of Andrew. He saw a young man who was incredibly raw, but eager. Andrew was like a big puppy, clumsy at times, unaware of his own strength, but desperate to learn. Hart was impressed by Andrew's conditioning. Most big men gassed out after 5 minutes. Andrew, thanks to his hockey and lacrosse background, could go for hours, but the training was brutal on the body. This is where the accumulation of damage accelerated. Learning to take a bump, falling flat on your back, sends a shock wave through the spine and into the skull. A trainee might take hundreds of bumps a day. Andrew Martin, with his long spine and heavy frame, was subjecting his body to the force of a car crash over and over again. He spent 8 months in this grueling boot camp. He learned the psychology of the ring, how to tell a story with a look, how to feed off the crowd, how to be a heel and a face. He also spent time training with Dory Funk Jr. at his Funking Conservatory in Florida, a finishing school for WWE prospects. It was during this time that Andrew Martin began to understand the duality of the business. Inside the ring, it was a performance, a cooperative dance. Outside the ring, it was a competition. Every other trainee was a rival. Everyone wanted the spot. Andrew realized that being big wasn't enough. He had to be better. He wrestled his first independent match in 1997 under the name Martin Kane. He was green, he was stiff, but he had presence. When he walked through the curtain, the crowd stopped talking. That it factor was undeniable. It didn't take long. The tapes of his training sessions made their way to Stamford, Connecticut, the headquarters of the WWF. Vince McMahon, the mastermind behind the company, famously loved big guys. When he saw footage of Andrew Martin, a 6'6" blonde powerhouse who could move like a cat, he didn't hesitate. In 1998, Andrew Martin signed his contract with the World Wrestling Federation. He was 23 years old. He had been wrestling for less than 2 years. He was skipping the minor leagues and going straight to the Super Bowl. Most wrestlers spend a decade toiling in bingo halls and high school gyms, earning $20 a night, honing their craft before they ever get a sniff of the WWF. Andrew Martin bypassed all of that. He was strapped into a rocket ship. He arrived at the WWF during a time of extreme volatility. The locker room was filled with icons: Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, The Rock, Triple H, Mick Foley. These were men at the absolute peak of their powers. For a shy kid from Whitby, it must have been terrifying. He wasn't just joining a sports team. He was joining a traveling circus of alpha males. But the company had a plan for him. They didn't want him to debut as a generic wrestler in tight trunks. They wanted to make a statement. They wanted to integrate him into the fabric of the show immediately. His debut was set. It wouldn't be in a match. It would be in a role that emphasized his size and his danger. On October 25th, 1998, on an episode of Sunday Night Heat, the rock band Mötley Crüe was performing live. They needed a bodyguard. Out walked Andrew Martin. He wore sunglasses, a black suit that struggled to contain his shoulders, and an earpiece. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, shoving crazed fans away from the band. He looked more like a rock star than Vince Neil did. The internet forums of the time lit up. Who is that guy? Look at the size of him. Is he a wrestler? The buzz had begun. The WWF machine was revving up. Andrew Martin was no longer just a kid from Ontario. He was a project. He was an investment. And soon, he would be known by a single monosyllabic name that would come to define his existence. He was about to become Test. The transition from a silent bodyguard to a named character in the World Wrestling Federation is a delicate art. If you rush it, the audience rejects it. If you wait too long, they lose interest. For Andrew Martin, the metamorphosis was strange, almost accidental, yet it perfectly encapsulated the chaotic creativity of the Attitude Era. He had spent weeks standing in the background, a towering monolith in a black suit, protecting the band Mötley Crüe and later other mid-card acts. He was a visual prop, a piece of intimidating scenery. But the audience, conditioned to expect violence, kept waiting for the statue to move. They wanted to see the giant strike. When he finally stepped into the ring to speak, the birth of his persona was minimalist genius. He would walk to the center of the canvas, grab the microphone, tap the head of it with a massive finger, and mutter 2 words in a deep, monotone bass: "Test, test." It was a roadie's mic check, a sound guy ensuring the equipment was working. But in the surreal theater of the WWF, it became his identity. He wasn't Andrew Martin anymore. He was simply Test. The name itself was a subject of playground rumors and internet speculation. Was it short for testosterone? A nod to his chemically enhanced physique? Was it a reference to his role as a tester for other wrestlers? The company never officially confirmed the testosterone theory, but in an era defined by blurred lines and edgy humor, the implication was heavy in the air. It fit him. He looked like a lab experiment gone right, a perfect specimen of synthetic evolution. But a cool name and a great look are only the entry fee. To stay in the WWF, you had to survive the politics. And Test was about to be thrown into the deepest, most shark-infested waters in the history of the business. By late 1998, the dominant force in the WWF was the corporation. This was a faction of villains led by the owner himself, Vince McMahon, and his son Shane. They represented the man, the authority, the establishment trying to crush the rebellious spirit of Stone Cold Steve Austin. To be invited into the corporation was the wrestling equivalent of being handed the keys to the kingdom. It meant you were going to be on television every single week. It meant you were going to be in the main event segments. It meant you were rubbing shoulders with The Rock, Kane, and Triple H. For a rookie with less than 2 years of experience, this was unheard of. Test was drafted into the group as the enforcer. His job was simple: stand behind Vince McMahon, look terrifying, and destroy anyone who got too close. This period was a trial by fire. Test wasn't just wrestling meaningless matches. He was taking bumps for the biggest stars in the industry. He was the guy The Rock would punch to get a crowd reaction. He was the guy Steve Austin would hit with a stunner to end the show. And he was good at it. Surprisingly good. Despite his size, Test was unselfish. He bumped theatrically. When he got hit, he made it look like he had been shot from a cannon. He understood his role: make the stars look bright. But in doing so, he started to shine himself. The fans began to notice that the big guy in the leather pants could actually move. He had a fluidity that was rare for a giant. He threw a big boot, a simple kick to the face, that was so precise and devastating it became a work of art. But being in the corporation also meant living the lifestyle. The travel schedule was grueling. 300 days a year on the road, rental cars, cheap motels, 4 a.m. gym sessions, and the constant pressure to maintain that superhero physique. This is where the cracks likely began to form, invisible to the naked eye. To keep that size, to keep that energy, and to manage the pain of being slammed onto plywood night after night, the toolkit of the wrestler became essential. Painkillers to sleep, stimulants to wake up. It was the industry standard. Andrew Martin, eager to keep his spot, did what was expected of him. He kept up. If 1998 was the introduction, 1999 was the rocket launch. In the summer of 1999, the WWF creative team handed Test the golden ticket. They placed him in an on-screen romance with Stephanie McMahon, the daughter of Vince McMahon. To understand the magnitude of this, you have to understand the hierarchy of wrestling. The McMahons are the royal family. Being involved in a storyline with them is the highest vote of confidence a wrestler can receive. It means the company sees you as a future world champion. It means they are investing their most valuable asset, their own family name, in your success. The story was a classic trope, the princess and the pauper. Stephanie was the sweet, innocent daddy's girl. Test was the rough-around-the-edges wrestler. They fell in love. But her brother, Shane McMahon, and her friends in the corporation disapproved. They didn't think Test was good enough for the royal bloodline. It was simple, effective drama. And it worked. For the first time, the fans weren't just impressed by Test's moves. They were emotionally invested in him. They wanted him to get the girl. They wanted him to beat the snobs. They cheered for him. Andrew Martin, the shy kid from Whitby, was becoming a romantic lead on the most watched show on cable television. He was gracing the covers of magazines. He was signing autographs for screaming teenage girls. He was on the precipice of becoming the next big. The climax of this storyline was set for SummerSlam 1999, one of the biggest pay-per-view events of the year. The match, Test versus Shane McMahon. The stipulation, a love her or leave her Greenwich Street fight. If Test won, he gained Shane's blessing to marry Stephanie. If he lost, he had to walk away forever. This match is often cited by wrestling historians as the absolute peak of Andrew Martin's career. It was his masterpiece. The match was brutal, chaotic, and electrifying. They fought around the ring, using weapons, breaking tables, putting their bodies on the line. Shane McMahon, known for his daredevil stunts, delivered an elbow drop through the announce table that remains iconic. But Test was the anchor. He caught Shane, he threw him, he sold the drama. In the final moments, Test defied the odds. He hit his finishing move, a diving elbow drop from the top rope, and pinned the owner's son. The referee counted to 3. The arena in Minneapolis exploded. It wasn't just a wrestling win. It was a narrative triumph. Stephanie ran to the ring. They embraced. Test hoisted her onto his shoulder. It was a picture-perfect ending. At that moment, standing in the center of the ring with his arms raised, Andrew Martin must have felt like he had conquered the world. He had delivered the match of the night. He was over with the crowd. He was dating the princess. The path to the world championship seemed clear. He was 24 years old, and he was the future. But in professional wrestling, happily ever after is just a setup for the next tragedy. The wedding was set for November 29th, 1999. It was promoted for weeks. A televised wedding is a wrestling tradition, usually ending in chaos, but this one felt different. It felt like a coronation. The plan, as far as anyone knew, was for Test and Stephanie to become the power couple of the WWF. However, behind the scenes, the tectonic plates of wrestling politics were shifting. Another star was rising, one with more political savvy, more experience, and a different vision for the future. Triple H. Triple H was already a top star, but he needed that final push to become the ultimate villain. He pitched an idea. What if he was the one who married Stephanie? What if he drugged her, took her to a drive-through chapel in Las Vegas, and ruined Test's life? It was a brilliant, devilish twist. But for Andrew Martin, it was a death knell. On the night of the wedding, as Test stood at the altar in his tuxedo, looking every bit the handsome groom, Triple H interrupted. He played a video on the Titantron. The video showed an unconscious Stephanie in a convertible, with Triple H mimicking her voice to say, "I do." The crowd went wild. It was shocking. It was hilarious. It was peak Attitude Era. But in the narrative, Test was destroyed. He had been cuckolded in front of millions. And then the twist deepened. Stephanie revealed she was in on it. She turned evil. She joined Triple H. Together they formed the McMahon-Helmsley era, dominating the show for the next 2 years. And Test? He was forgotten. The storyline that was built on his back, the heat that he helped create, was transferred entirely to Triple H. Triple H got the girl. Triple H got the championship. Triple H got the main event spot that Test had been groomed for. This moment, the interrupted wedding, is the sliding doors moment of Andrew Martin's life. If the wedding had gone as planned, Test would have been the son-in-law character. He would have been cemented in the main event scene. He would have been protected by the booking. History might have been completely different. Instead, he was cast aside. He had served his purpose. He was the foil to launch the real stars. In later years, Martin would speak about this with a mixture of professionalism and deep, lingering hurt. He called it an evaporated opportunity. He watched as the rocket ship he was strapped to was suddenly redirected to someone else. It wasn't just a storyline demotion. It was a psychological blow. It told him explicitly, "You are good, but you are not him." He was 24, and he had already peaked. He had touched the sun and been burned. Following the wedding angle, Test's position on the card plummeted. He went from main eventing SummerSlam to wrestling in the opening matches. The demotion was swift and brutal. This is where the mental toll begins to compound the physical toll. Imagine the mindset. You have done everything asked of you. You got in shape. You learned the moves. You got the crowd to cheer. You played the game perfectly. And your reward is to be pushed to the back of the line. For an athlete driven by competition, this is devastating. For a young man in a high-pressure environment, it breeds insecurity. Did he not look good enough? Was he not big enough? The answer, in the warped logic of a wrestler's mind, is always try harder, get bigger, take more pain. As we move into the year 2000, we see Andrew Martin double down. His physique gets even more extreme. The veins become more prominent. The jawline hardens. He begins to wrestle with a chip on his shoulder, a stiffness and aggression that wasn't there before. He wasn't wrestling to entertain anymore. He was wrestling to prove them wrong. He was wrestling angry, and in the background the physical damage was accruing. The neck bumps, the spinal compression, the concussions that went undiagnosed because he was too afraid to ask for time off, fearing he would lose his spot even further. The prince who never was beginning to turn into the tragic king. The year 2000 arrived with a cold new reality for Andrew Martin. The blinding spotlight of the main event scene, which had briefly illuminated him as the future of the company, had shifted away. It was now firmly focused on established icons like Triple H, The Rock, and Stone Cold Steve Austin. Test was no longer the chosen one or the next big thing. He had been relegated to the supporting cast, a dangerous and frustrating place in the industry known as the mid-card. In this unforgiving tier of the roster, the pay is lower, the travel is just as grueling, and the fight for television time becomes a desperate, a weekly scramble. But Andrew did not quit, nor did he let his frustration show in the ring. Instead, he pivoted with a professionalism that earned him the respect of his peers, even as the creative team struggled to find a direction for him. The writers eventually placed him in a tag team, pairing him with another giant named Albert and a devastatingly beautiful fitness model named Trish Stratus. They called the team TNA, a name that was intentionally crass and perfectly in tune with the era's obsession with shock value and sex appeal. For Andrew, this assignment was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it kept him on global television every single week, but on the other, it forced him back into the role of a background player. The cameras were no longer zooming in on his athletic prowess. They were fixated on Trish Stratus. He had become the furniture in someone else's room, a prop to facilitate the stardom of others. Yet this period revealed the depth of Andrew Martin's character. Many wrestlers in his position would have sulked or phoned in their performances, but Test worked harder than ever. He and Albert became one of the most reliable units in the company, serving as the base for smaller teams, like the Hardy Boys, to launch their high-flying attacks. Test evolved in the ring, perfecting a big boot finisher that was so sudden and violent it would make crowds gasp before they could even cheer. He developed a top rope elbow drop that a man of his size had no business performing, proving night after night that he was one of the most agile big men in the world. Despite his consistency, the narrative ceiling above him remained firm. His team was used as an obstacle for the heroes to overcome, never the heroes themselves. For a competitor like Martin, who had tasted the main event and stood in the ring with the McMahons, this stagnation must have gnawed at him. But in 2001, the entire landscape of the industry shifted beneath his feet. The World Wrestling Federation purchased its rival, WCW, ending the Monday Night Wars and launching a chaotic storyline known as the Invasion. This period provided Test with a brief, glorious renaissance. The writers needed credible threats who looked like they could dismantle a roster, and Test fit the bill perfectly. Although he had been a company loyalist his entire career, the storyline saw him turn his back on the WWF, citing the unfair treatment he had endured, a rare instance where his real-life frustration was allowed to bleed into the script. Suddenly, Test was a killer again. He wasn't just losing matches, he was collecting championships. He engaged in brutal brawls for the Hardcore Championship, enduring weapon-filled matches that required a terrifyingly high pain threshold. He defeated technical wizards like William Regal to win the European Championship, and in his crowning achievement of that year, he defeated Edge to win the Intercontinental Championship. This was the workhorse title, the belt that signified you were the best wrestler on the show. For a few months, he was a double champion, holding both the Intercontinental and Tag Team titles simultaneously. He was draped in gold and looked unstoppable. Fans from this era remember Invasion Test fondly as an aggressive, arrogant bully who could back up every word. But even amidst this success, the physical toll was mounting in silence. The hardcore matches involved trash cans, steel steps, and unprotected chair shots to the head. Every time a steel chair cracked against his skull, the clock on his lifespan sped up. The applause was loud, but the damage accumulating in his brain was invisible. By 2002, as the Invasion angle faded, the writers once again shifted his direction. They tapped into post-9/11 patriotism to create a faction called the Un-Americans. Alongside Lance Storm, Christian, and William Regal, Test became a virulent anti-American villain. It was cheap heat, but it was effective. He cut his long blonde hair short, stopped playing to the crowd, and adopted a colder, meaner persona. This was arguably his best work as a character actor. He was no longer just a mute giant. He was cutting promos, insulting the fans, and burning the American flag, metaphorically. He became a legitimate threat again, even entering a feud with The Undertaker. To be trusted in a program with the conscience of the WWE meant he was respected, and he held his own, looking like he truly belonged in the ring with the legends. However, the creative team's whim is a fickle thing. As the group disbanded, Test was left without a story, and when writers get bored, they can get cruel. They paired him with Stacy Keibler, another stunning valet, but instead of making him a desirable star, they wrote him as abusive and misogynistic. Then came the humiliation that would stick to him for the rest of his career. In a promo, The Rock referred to Test's fans as testicles. It was a juvenile pun, but the company loved it. Commentary began to use the term regularly, mocking him on live broadcasts. Imagine being a 28-year-old athlete, breaking your body every night to be taken seriously as a dangerous competitor, while your employer actively brands you as a joke about male anatomy. It undercut his menace and told the audience not to take him seriously. Friends of Martin later said he hated it, but in the wrestling business, you do what you are told or you go home. So he went out there night after night and listened to the chants, swallowing his pride while his body began to fail. The human spine is a marvel of engineering, but it is not designed for professional wrestling. It is not designed to compress under the weight of a 300-pound man dropping a leg on you, nor is it designed to absorb the whiplash of a clothesline 200 times a year. By 2004, Andrew Martin's neck was a ticking time bomb. He had been wrestling a high-impact style for nearly 7 years straight, taking flat-back bumps that sent shockwaves up his spine and delivering moves that jarred his own frame. In July 2004, the pain became impossible to ignore. His hands were going numb and his strength was fading. The diagnosis was severe, requiring a spinal fusion surgery. Dr. Lloyd Youngblood, the surgeon to the wrestling stars, had to remove the damaged discs and insert a titanium plate to fuse the vertebrae together. The surgery was a success medically, but for a wrestler's career, it was a devastating halt. The recovery time was projected to be at least a year. Andrew went from the adrenaline-fueled life of the road to sitting alone in his house in Tampa, unable to turn his head. This period marked the dark turning point of his life. To manage the excruciating post-surgery pain, doctors prescribed opioids like oxycodone. For a normal patient, these are a temporary measure. For a wrestler whose identity is tied to physical performance, they became a lifeline. But there was a psychological component as well. When the roar of the crowd stops, a deafening silence follows. The adrenaline withdrawal is real, and depression often sets in. The pills filled that void. They numbed the physical pain in his neck, but they also numbed the anxiety about his career and the loneliness of his isolation. Then came the final insult delivered by the business he loved. On November 1st, 2004, while he was still recovering from the surgery, the WWE released him. They fired him because he was inactive, a cold business decision that felt like a betrayal to Andrew. He had broken his neck for them, taken humiliating storylines for them, and been a loyal soldier. The moment he was of no use, they cut him loose. He was now unemployed, injured, and sitting on a stockpile of painkillers. The structure of his life had collapsed, and for the next year, Andrew Martin became a ghost. He didn't wrestle. He focused on rehab, but he also became obsessed with rebuilding his body into something undeniable. He hit the weights with a manic intensity and began using anabolic steroids heavily again. When he finally emerged in late 2005, he looked terrifying. He was bigger than he had ever been, shredded but with a bloated, unnatural look that screamed of chemical enhancement. His goal was singular: to get back to the WWE and prove them wrong. It worked. Seeing photos of the monster he had become, the WWE reached out in 2006 to sign him for their revived ECW brand. His return in July 2006 should have been his redemption arc. He debuted as a monster villain, destroying opponents and looking like a world champion contender. But the Andrew Martin who returned was not the same man who had left. The locker room noticed it immediately. He was moody, distant, and prone to snapping at people for no reason. On television, his eyes looked glazed and dead, lacking the spark of his earlier years. He was going through the motions, a chemically propelled golem. The end of his WWE career came swiftly. In February 2007, Tess failed a drug test under the company's newly implemented wellness policy. The results showed elevated testosterone levels, confirming what his physique had already suggested. He was suspended for 30 days, but the writing was on the wall. Andrew claimed he had a prescription for his past injuries, but the company, under pressure to clean up its image, could not afford the scandal. On February 27, 2007, just a week after the suspension was announced, WWE released him for the second time. There was no shock this time, only a sad inevitability. Andrew Martin was 31 years old. He had been fired from his dream job twice. His body was failing, his reputation was tarnished, and the addiction that had started as a whisper was now a scream. He packed his bags and left the arena for the last time. The character of Test was dead. Now, only Andrew Martin remained, and he was about to face the fight of his life against his own deteriorating brain. When the doors of the World Wrestling Federation closed on Andrew Martin for the second and final time in February 2007, the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was suffocating. For a man who had spent his entire adult life defined by the roar of the crowd, the sudden quiet of a regular life was terrifying. He was 31 years old, an age where most men are just hitting their professional stride. Yet, he was staring at the wreckage of a career that had promised him everything and left him with nothing but a broken neck and a dependence on chemicals. The release from his contract stripped him of more than just a paycheck. It stripped him of his identity. Without the schedule, without the locker room, and without the character of Tess to hide behind, Andrew Martin was forced to confront the man in the mirror, and that man was in serious trouble. In the immediate aftermath of his firing, there was a brief, desperate attempt to cling to the only world he knew. In the summer of 2007, Andrew surfaced in TNA Wrestling, the only other televised promotion in the United States that offered a semblance of the big stage. His debut was visually striking. He appeared as the Punisher, Andrew Martin, aligning himself with the darker characters of that promotion. He looked monstrous, his physique even larger and more vascular than before, a clear indication that he was still pushing his body beyond its natural limits to maintain the aesthetic of a superstar. To the fans watching, it seemed like he might be poised for a career renaissance, a chance to be the big fish in a smaller pond. He wrestled a high-profile match at the Hard Justice pay-per-view, teaming with Sting and Abyss. On paper, it was a success. He moved well enough, he looked the part, and the crowd reacted to his sheer size. But behind the scenes, the reality was grim. The engine was running on fumes. The locker room in TNA saw what the WWE officials had seen. A man who was physically imposing but mentally eroding. His tenure there was incredibly short-lived, lasting only a handful of appearances before he quietly departed. It was a tacit admission that his body, held together by titanium plates and painkillers, simply could not endure the grind of televised wrestling anymore. Following the failure of his TNA run, Andrew embarked on a farewell tour of sorts, taking bookings in Europe. Ireland, in particular, had always been a stronghold for him, a place where the fans still treated him like the royalty he had almost been. But it was during this tour in early 2008 that the finality of his situation truly set in. He announced his retirement from professional wrestling. In a statement posted to his MySpace page, a relic of the era that served as his primary line of communication with the world, he expressed a deep, simmering resentment toward the industry. He wrote that he hated wrestling, that he was done with the politics, the injuries, and the fake friendships. It was a lash out from a wounded place. He claimed he was moving on to new ventures, perhaps a career in real estate or personal training, attempting to project an image of stability and future planning. But retirement for a wrestler is rarely a clean break. It is often a slow, agonizing withdrawal. Without the physical outlet of the ring to expend his aggression, and without the adoration of the fans to validate his existence, the demons that had been nipping at his heels began to consume him whole. The year 2008 became a public chronicle of his descent. The discipline that had once made him a top-tier athlete evaporated, replaced by the chaotic impulsivity of addiction. The first major warning sign flashed in September 2007, just months after his WWE release, when he was arrested for driving under the influence in Florida. The mugshot that circulated online was shocking to those who remembered the fresh-faced suitor of Stephanie McMahon. In the photo, Andrew looked bloated, his eyes glassy and vacant, his face telling a story of profound confusion. But one arrest can be dismissed as a mistake, a pattern cannot. In April 2008, he was arrested again in West Palm Beach, once more for a DUI. This time, the police report detailed a man who was slumped over the wheel, unaware of his surroundings. When the officers woke him, he was disoriented, struggling to comprehend basic instructions. It was not the behavior of a reckless party animal. It was the behavior of a man whose brain was misfiring. At the time, the public narrative was simple and cruel. Another wrestler gone bad, another steroid casualty spiraling out of control. The dirt sheets and internet forums mocked him, posting his mugshots alongside jokes about his fall from grace. But looking back with the knowledge we have now, these arrests were not just crimes. They were symptoms. Dr. Bennett O. Malu, the pathologist who would later examine Andrew's brain, would point to this period as classic evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. The disease, caused by the accumulation of blows to the head, destroys the frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, judgment, and emotional regulation. Andrew wasn't just making bad choices. He was losing the neurological capacity to make good ones. The aggression, the substance abuse, and the erratic driving were the manifestations of a brain that was slowly rotting from the inside out. He was fighting a war against his own biology, and he was losing. Amidst this legal and medical turmoil, his personal life was also collapsing. Andrew had been in a high-profile relationship with Kelly Kelly, a WWE wrestler 10 years his junior. By all accounts, he loved her deeply, and she cared for him. But the relationship was volatile. You cannot build a stable house on a crumbling foundation. As Andrew's addiction deepened and his behavior became more unpredictable, the relationship strained under the weight. The isolation of living in Tampa, a city filled with wrestlers, but lonely for those who have fallen out of the loop, exacerbated his depression. He spent his days in a cycle of training and numbing, trying to maintain the body of a god while feeling like a ghost. Friends who saw him during this time described a man who fluctuated wildly between hope and despair. One day he would talk excitedly about getting clean and starting a business. The next, he would be unreachable, lost in a fog of oxycodone. There was, however, one final flickering beacon of hope. In August 2008, recognizing that he was in a death spiral, Andrew reached out for help. The WWE, to their credit, has a policy of paying for substance abuse rehabilitation for former talent. Andrew checked into a facility in Hanley Center in West Palm Beach. It was his last stand. For 30 days, he tried to detox, to clear the chemical haze from his mind, and find the Andrew Martin who existed before the pills and the pain. He completed the program. He emerged looking healthier, sounding clearer. He told friends that he was done with the drugs, that he wanted to live. But rehabilitation is not a cure. It is merely a pause. When he stepped back out into the world, the underlying issues, the chronic pain in his fused neck and the invisible damage in his brain, were still there, waiting for him. The tragedy of addiction is that it is a patient predator. It waits for a moment of weakness, a moment of pain, or a moment of loneliness. And for Andrew Martin, alone in his apartment in early 2009, the moments of loneliness were becoming longer and darker. The final week of Andrew Martin's life began with a deceptive quiet. It was March 2009, and the humid warmth of the Florida spring was settling over Tampa. Andrew was preparing to celebrate his 34th birthday, a milestone that should have marked the prime of his life. To the outside world, specifically the neighbors in his upscale condominium complex, he appeared to be a man keeping to himself, perhaps wrestling with the mundane struggles of early retirement. They saw a giant who walked with a heavy gait, a man who offered polite but brief nods in the hallway. But inside apartment 721, the atmosphere was thick with isolation. The structure of rehabilitation had faded, and the demons of addiction, patient and opportunistic, had returned to fill the void left by his career. The relationship with Kelly Kelly had ended, severing his last major tether to the world of emotional intimacy. He was alone with his thoughts, and for a man with his medical history, that was the most dangerous place to be. On March 12th, the silence that surrounded him deepened. Friends and family who had been checking in on him, knowing his fragility in his recent battles, stopped receiving replies to their text messages. Calls went straight to voicemail. In the wrestling community, silence is often the first siren of tragedy. People began to worry. On the morning of March 13th, 2009, 4 days before he was set to blow out the candles on his birthday cake, a concerned friend contacted the authorities to request a welfare check. A police officer from the Tampa Police Department arrived at the complex, likely expecting a routine check, perhaps hoping to find a man who was simply sleeping off a rough night. Instead, upon entering the apartment, the officer found a scene of devastating stillness. Andrew Martin was discovered lifeless. His massive frame collapsed in a way that suggested not a violent struggle, but a sudden chemical shutoff. He was gone. The news of his death rippled through the wrestling world with a speed that was both shocking and sickeningly familiar. It had been less than 2 years since the horrors of the Chris Benoit murder-suicide, and the industry was still suffering from a collective PTSD regarding premature deaths. When the headlines broke, former WWE star Test found dead at 33, the reaction among fans was grief, but among the locker room veterans, it was a heavy, resigned nodding of heads. They had seen the signs. They had seen the bloating, the glazed eyes, the erratic behavior. It was the wrestler's death, a euphemism for a tragedy that everyone saw coming, but no one knew how to stop. The initial police reports ruled out foul play immediately. There was no suicide note, no sign of a break-in. It appeared to be exactly what it was. A man who had taken too much of something to make the pain go away and simply never woke up. The first answers came from the toxicology report, and they were tragically predictable. The medical examiner found a lethal cocktail in his system, but the primary culprit was oxycodone. It was an accidental overdose. This distinction is crucial for the narrative of his life. Andrew Martin did not seemingly intend to kill himself that night. He was not seeking death, he was seeking relief. He was a man in chronic pain, living with a fused neck and a battered skeleton, who miscalculated the dosage required to numb the screaming nerves in his body. It was a slip into the abyss, a mathematical error made by a brain that was already compromised by years of substance abuse. But while the toxicology report explained how he died, it did not explain why he had unraveled so completely in his final years. For that answer, science had to look deeper than the blood. It had to look at the brain itself. In a move that would change the legacy of Andrew Martin forever, his brain was retained for analysis by Dr. Bennett Omalu. Dr. Omalu was already a controversial figure in the sports world. The pathologist who had taken on the National Football League by discovering and naming chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. He was the man who had looked into the brains of deceased football players and found the wreckage of dementia caused by repeated head trauma. When Dr. Omalu placed samples of Andrew Martin's brain tissue under his microscope, the expectation from the wrestling industry was perhaps that he would find damage from steroid abuse or evidence of a party lifestyle. What he found instead was a horror story written in protein. Dr. Omalu's findings were unequivocal and terrifying. He stated that Andrew Martin's brain did not look like that of a 33-year-old man. It resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. The tissue was riddled with brown stains of tau protein, the hallmark of severe CTE. This protein accumulates in the brain after repeated concussions and subconcussive blows, slowly strangling the healthy neurons and destroying the brain's ability to function. The damage was concentrated in the regions of the brain that control impulse, mood, memory and cognition. This was the smoking gun. This was the missing piece of the puzzle that explained everything about Andrew's decline. The revelations from the autopsy recontextualized his entire final act. The mood swings that had alienated his friends were not just personality flaws, they were symptoms of organic brain damage. The impulsive arrests for driving under the influence were not just bad judgment. They were the result of a frontal lobe that had been pulverized by steel chairs and high-impact bumps. The inability to kick the addiction was not just a lack of willpower, it was a neurological failure. Dr. Omalu argued that the CTE was the primary driver of his depression and his substance abuse. Andrew Martin was trying to self-medicate a brain that was literally rotting inside his skull. The repeated concussions he had sustained, from the stiffness of the independent circuit, to the brutal training in the dungeon, to the hardcore matches in the WWE, had created a degenerative disease that stripped him of his humanity long before the oxycodone stopped his heart. This diagnosis turned Andrew Martin from a cautionary tale about drugs into a martyr of the industry's violence. He was the first wrestler to have such a high-profile, post-mortem diagnosis of CTE following the Benoit tragedy, and his case was unique because he had not committed a violent crime. He had only hurt himself. It forced the world to look at the big boot and the top rope elbow, not as athletic feats, but as acts of cumulative self-destruction. The autopsy photos and the slides of his brain tissue became evidence in a much larger trial, a trial of public opinion regarding the safety of professional wrestling. The man who had once been a pristine physical specimen, the Test, who looked like a comic book hero, was revealed to be internally shattered, a victim of a sport that demanded everything he had and gave him brain damage in return. The revelation of Dr. Omalu's findings offered a heartbreaking vindication for those who loved him. It proved that the sweet kid from Whitby hadn't simply gone bad. He was biologically broken, his personality disintegrated by a disease he couldn't control. But while this truth brought closure to his family, it brought panic to the WWE. Andrew wasn't a monster like Chris Benoit. He was a loyal soldier who had destroyed himself for the job. That made him a sympathetic victim, and in the world of corporate liability, a sympathetic victim is the most dangerous kind of ghost. Consequently, Andrew's brain became Exhibit A in a massive class action lawsuit against the WWE. The science was screaming a truth the industry wanted to ignore, that the high-impact style of the Attitude Era had turned the brains of men like Test into ticking time bombs. Although the lawsuits were eventually dismissed on procedural grounds, the damage to his legacy was done. To the corporate history books, Test became an inconvenient truth. While his peers are celebrated with Hall of Fame rings, Andrew Martin has been largely scrubbed from the narrative, a ghost in the archives, erased not because he wasn't good enough, but because his broken brain asked questions that the industry is too afraid to answer. The personal aftermath for those who actually knew him was far more painful than the corporate maneuvering. For his peers, the men and women who shared locker rooms and rental cars with him, the loss was confusing. They had to reconcile the Andrew they loved, the shy, polite Canadian who loved practical jokes and protected his friends, with the erratic, angry stranger who emerged in the final years. Val Venice, one of his closest friends and traveling partners, spoke openly about the heartbreak of watching Andrew deteriorate. He described the helplessness of seeing a friend drowning in plain sight, knowing that the Test the world saw was a mask hiding a man in excruciating pain. Kelly, the woman who had loved him through the darkest period, was left to carry the weight of what-ifs, the burden of wondering if anything more could have been done to save him from the spiral. For these people, the autopsy didn't just explain the behavior, it validated their grief. It told them that the friend they lost hadn't abandoned them. He had been taken from them cell by cell by a disease that no one knew how to diagnose until it was too late. In the void left by his absence, the wrestling industry did change, albeit slowly and reluctantly. The death of Andrew Martin, compounded by others in that era, forced a tightening of the wellness policy. The chair shot to the head, once a staple of the violent ballet of wrestling, was banned. Concussion protocols became stricter. If a wrestler gets knocked loopy in a match today, the referee stops the fight. The doctors step in. There's a safety net now that did not exist for Andrew. In a grim irony, the very protections that might have saved his life and his brain were implemented largely because his generation died to prove they were necessary. Andrew Martin is a silent architect of the modern, safer wrestling landscape. He paid the tuition for the safety of the current stars, a sacrificial lamb on the altar of sports entertainment's evolution. As the years passed, the shock of his death faded into a dull ache for the wrestling community, but the questions remained. The tragedy of Andrew Martin is not just that he died, but that he was dismantled. He was a man built for a specific purpose, to look like a god and fight like a demon. And when that purpose used him up, there was no plan B for his survival. The silence that hangs over his legacy is not one of respect, it is one of fear. Fear of what his broken brain says about the cost of the tickets we buy. Fear that the spectacle we love requires a blood sacrifice that we are too polite to acknowledge. Andrew Martin remains the ghost in the machine, the reminder that the superheroes we watch on television are made of flesh and bone, and that sometimes the price of glory is paid in a currency that no amount of money can reimburse.